Hi, this is a conversation with Michael J. Douma. Michael, why is it that the classical liberal history matters?
Well, first of all, thanks, Luis, for inviting me here and for setting this up. Classical liberal history is primarily history of liberty. And so it matters because our focus in history should be about freedom, about free people and why liberty matters. And in the book, which I'm the co-editor of, What is Classical Liberal History? I describe it as that the foundations of the historical profession in the 18th and mostly the 19th century were liberal. That is, as history developed, it was interested in this question of liberty. It was interested in the rational investigation of sources, in debating how we can make free societies. And so this has always been a theme of history, but it sometimes is obscured by other themes. So we can write history with other purposes than the history of liberty.
That's my next question. As opposed to what? Why is it different from other perspectives?
Right. So I'm defining classical liberal history here in this book, really for the first time. And I think even though classical liberalism is really well known among political scientists, political theorists, historians, etc., classical liberal history has never been defined as something because it's been part of the mainstream. It was the origins of history. So we can write history from many different perspectives, and in the book I list a few of them. There is, of course, the Marxist view of history. So you have Marxist theories about how things should develop, and then you investigate it from his perspective. You have the conservative view of history. And the conservative view of history is that we can learn moral lessons from the past. And it's important to understand the structures of society and the order. And so we should study powerful men and institutions that show us how we should be. Then there's progressive history. Progressive history is the study of how we're moving forward towards some better future. And so progressives want to study the history to learn things about how we can create better societies, right? So these are some of the major approaches, general approaches to history. And I contrast that with classical liberal history, which I really think is something that overlaps with those other ones, but is primarily focused on how do we create free societies. And when we look backwards, what we should be concerned about is not necessarily class or nation or one particular person, but is about freedom of people in general. So that's the idea.
So all things considered, what is the role of individuals in history?
This is a very good point. So a lot of, say, Marxist history likes to talk about history from the bottom up. And this is the history actually of a lot of social historians from the 1960s and 70s forward, is we've tried in the last 50 years to recover people, individual people, because if you look back, most of history that's written in the history of the world is about nations and is about kings and queens and these types of things. And so there's always been individuals in that story, but classical liberal history is interested in any individual. So it could be, it could be a common person, it could be a politician, it could be great men and women, entrepreneurs, and other people who have done great things. But the classical liberal view of history is that we have to start with the individual. We cannot start, if we're going to study the past, we cannot start with the nation state as our unit of analysis, or we shouldn't. We shouldn't start with class. We shouldn't start with big grand themes. If we want to understand how history developed, we have to understand the mind of the individual and individual decision making, right? And so it's really not about great men, but it's about men and women that are making decisions and what important decisions can they make.
So is that why the classical liberal values are valuable for history?
Certainly. I think one of the greatest classical liberal values that overlaps so much with the study of history is openness, right? The views of John Stuart Mill that we should listen to the least of the view that's the least well heard, right, in all these multiple interpretations. And so as history becomes a professional discipline, really only 150 years ago is it professionalizing. It takes in these liberal values that we can't just support power, right? That we can't lie to ourselves about the past, that we have to look at evidence, that we have to argue things through. And liberalism has always been about openness and debate and discovery of the truth. Liberalism in its 19th century form and the classical liberal inheritance today is about trying to improve things, improve society through the application of what we learn.
And Michael, in this context, is it possible to grasp which are the most dangerous threats in modern times, threats for freedom?
So you're asking, what does the study of history tell us about threats to liberty in the modern day? There's plenty, right? So when I talk about classical liberal history as the study of freedom, we should also be studying unfreedom, the opposite of freedom, which is things like slavery, genocide, gulags in Russia, these types of things. And so if we make liberty of individual rights matter, individuals matter in history, we have to study these points in the past where rights were trampled on, where people were killed. And sometimes it's very difficult, to face up to these facts, especially if you're a politician or a person of power. You want to maintain the right story that helps you stay where you are. But classical liberal history or historians demand that we're honest with ourselves, right? And that we look to these mistakes of the past and try to learn from them. Because what's important is not maintaining social structures, but telling the truth so that we can increase the amount of freedom.